The lights dimmed, and the crowd held its breath. Thousands of fans stood frozen, eyes locked on the stage, waiting for the moment that would change everything. Then, suddenly, the music hit, and there he was, stepped into the spotlight, dressed in his iconic suit, moving with the same energy that had made him a legend. The screams were deafening. People cried, shouted, and reached out as if they were witnessing something almost supernatural. But that night, something felt different. No one could explain it at first. It wasn't obvious. If you were just another fan in the crowd, you probably wouldn't have noticed. The voice sounded right, the moves were there, the presence, at least on the surface, was still electric. But for those who had followed Elvis closely, who had studied every performance, every gesture, every subtle expression, there was a strange disconnect. It was like watching someone who looked exactly like Elvis, but wasn't entirely him. Backstage, whispers had already begun long before the show ended. Crew members exchanged uneasy glances. Some said he seemed quieter than usual before going on stage. Others noticed he avoided eye contact, keeping to himself in a way that didn't match his usual charisma. One band member later recalled how Elvis didn't joke around like he normally would. There was no laughter, no lightness, just silence and focus. It was as if the man about to perform wasn't the same man they knew. As the performance continued, the feeling only grew stronger. The movements were precise, almost too perfect, like they were being carefully copied rather than naturally expressed. Even the way he interacted with the audience felt slightly off. Elvis was known for connecting deeply with his fans, locking eyes, smiling in a way that made each person feel seen. But that night, it felt distant, mechanical, like a performance being executed rather than lived. Then came the moment that fans would talk about for years. During one of his most famous songs, something unexpected happened. For just a split second, he hesitated. It was small, so small that most people missed it, but for those paying attention, it was chilling. Elvis never hesitated. He was known for his confidence, his instinct, his ability to own every second on stage. But this pause felt different. It felt like uncertainty, or worse, unfamiliarity. After the show, the rumors spread like wildfire. Some fans dismissed it, saying everyone has off nights. Others weren't so sure. They began comparing this performance to older ones, analyzing every detail. The differences, once noticed, became impossible to ignore. The posture, the timing, the subtle expressions, they all seemed just slightly wrong. And then came the theory that refused to die. The idea that the man on stage wasn't really Elvis, not entirely. At first, it sounded ridiculous, a conspiracy created by overthinking fans. But as more stories surfaced, the idea gained traction. People began pointing to other performances where similar oddities appeared. They spoke of nights when Elvis seemed like two completely different people, one vibrant and alive, the other distant and almost robotic. The question slowly grew louder. What if something was happening behind the scenes that no one knew about? Years passed, and the mystery only deepened. Prince remained one of the most celebrated figures in music history, but the whispers never fully disappeared. They lingered in the background, quietly passed from fan to fan, from insider to insider. Most people ignored them. Some couldn't. And then, decades later, a voice emerged that changed everything. Prince's son had spent her entire life surrounded by the legacy of her father. She had seen things no fan ever could. She had experienced moments that never made it into documentaries or interviews. And for years, she stayed silent. Maybe it was out of respect. Maybe it was out of fear of how the world would react. Or maybe it was because some truths are too heavy to share. But eventually, she began to speak. Not all at once, not in a single shocking statement. Instead, it came in pieces, small details that didn't seem significant at first, but slowly formed a bigger picture. She talked about her father's life behind the scenes, about the pressure he faced, about how fame changed everything. She described moments from her childhood that felt confusing at the time, times when her father seemed completely present, warm, loving, full of life, and other times when he felt distant, almost like a different person entirely. As a child, she didn't understand it. How could she? But looking back, those memories took on a new meaning. There were nights when Elvis would prepare for a performance in a way that felt unusual, quiet, focused, almost detached. And then there were nights when he was full of energy, joking with everyone, completely at ease. The contrast was impossible to ignore. It was like watching two versions of the same man. And then came the statement that made people stop and listen. Lisa Marie hinted that the man the world saw on stage wasn't always the full story. She didn't say it directly, not at first, but the implication was there. The idea that something had been hidden from the public, something carefully controlled, something that kept the legend alive, no matter what was happening behind the scenes. Suddenly, the old rumors didn't seem so crazy anymore. Fans began revisiting old footage with a new perspective. They looked for the signs Lisa Marie had described, the differences in behavior, the subtle changes in presence. And the more they looked, the more they found. What if the real Elvis, the man behind the fame, the pressure, the expectations, wasn't always the one standing under those bright stage lights? What if the performances, the moments the world cherished most, were only part of a much bigger, more complicated truth? As the questions grew, so did the mystery.
And for the first time, it felt like the answers might finally be within reach. Because if Lisa Marie Presley was ready to speak, then maybe the world was finally ready to hear what really happened. The silence that followed those early revelations didn't last long. Once it began opening up, even in fragments, it was enough to reignite a mystery many thought had been buried forever. Fans who once dismissed the strange stories now leaned in closer, re-watching old footage, rereading interviews, searching for something they might have missed. And what they started to find was unsettling, not because it proved anything directly, but because it raised even more questions. The deeper people looked into the life of Elvis, the clearer it became that his world was far more controlled than anyone had imagined. His schedule wasn't just busy, it was relentless. Every appearance, every performance, every movement was carefully planned, monitored, and protected. To the public, it looked like the life of a superstar, but behind the scenes, it felt more like a system designed to keep something running, no matter the cost. Lisa Marie had hinted at this pressure before, but now her words carried a different weight. She spoke about how her father was rarely ever truly alone. There were always people around, managers, assistants, security, advisors. At the center of it all was Colonel Parker, the man who had helped build Elvis into a global icon. To the world, Parker was a genius, the mastermind behind one of the greatest careers in music history. But according to whispers that had circulated for years, his control went far beyond business decisions. Some insiders believed that Parker didn't just manage Elvis, he controlled him, not in a dramatic, obvious way, but through constant pressure, expectations, and an unbreakable system that kept the show going no matter what. Canceling performances wasn't an option. Slowing down wasn't an option. The machine had to keep moving.
And that's where the theory took a darker turn. Because if Elvis couldn't always meet those demands, then how did the show go on? Lisa Marie never directly accused anyone of anything. She was careful with her words, almost as if she understood how powerful and dangerous those implications could be. But she did describe moments that didn't quite make sense. Nights when her father seemed exhausted beyond explanation. Times when he appeared disconnected, like he was somewhere else entirely. And yet somehow the performances still happened. Fans began to connect these details with stories from former crew members. Some claimed there were strict rules backstage, rules about who could approach Elvis, when they could speak to him, and what they were allowed to say. Others described a strange tension before certain shows, like everyone was waiting for something to go wrong, but hoping it wouldn't. Then there were the accounts that sounded almost unbelievable. Stories of last-minute changes, of Elvis avoiding certain people before going on stage, of brief moments where even those closest to him felt unsure, like they were standing next to someone who looked exactly like Elvis, but felt slightly off. One former musician, who chose to remain anonymous, described a performance where everything seemed perfect from the audience's perspective. The voice was flawless, the timing was precise, the movements were iconic. But backstage, he said,
something didn't feel right. He couldn't explain it clearly, only that the energy was different, controlled, almost rehearsed in a way that went beyond normal preparation. These weren't the kinds of stories that could be easily proven. There was no single piece of evidence, no clear moment that confirmed anything. But taken together, they painted a picture that was hard to ignore. And then Lisa Marie shared something that shifted everything again. She spoke about identity, not in a literal sense, but in a deeply personal one. She described how her father struggled with the weight of being Elvis Presley, how the world expected him to be larger than life every second of every day, how there was no room for weakness, no space to simply be human. According to her, there were times when that pressure created a kind of separation, a gap between who Elvis truly was and who he had to be for the world. And sometimes, that gap became so wide that even those closest to him could feel it. It wasn't about a physical double, she suggested. Not exactly. It was about something more complicated, more unsettling. The idea that the man on stage wasn't always the same man off stage, not because someone replaced him, but because the real Elvis was slowly being buried under the version the world demanded to see. This interpretation changed everything. Suddenly, the strange performances, the subtle differences, the moments that felt off, they didn't need a conspiracy to be explained. They could be something even more real, a human being pushed to the edge, forced to become a character so completely that he sometimes disappeared inside it. But even with that explanation, some questions remained. Why did certain performances feel so different from others? Why did some insiders continue to hint at something more than just emotional struggle? And why did Lisa Marie, even after sharing so much, still seem to hold something back? There was a hesitation in her words, a carefulness that suggested there were details she wasn't ready to reveal, or perhaps couldn't. Every time she came close to saying something definitive, she would pull back, choosing instead to speak in hints and fragments. It was enough to keep the mystery alive. And maybe that was the point, because the truth, whatever it was, didn't fit into a simple explanation. It wasn't just about fame or pressure or performance. It was something layered, something that lived in the space between reality and perception. As fans continued digging, one thing became clear. The story wasn't just about music or fame. It was about identity, control, and the cost of becoming a legend. And if Lisa Marie Presley was only telling part of the story, then what was she still holding back? By the time the third wave of attention hit, the conversation had changed completely. What once sounded like a wild theory had now evolved into something far more complex, something that blurred the line between rumor and reality. Fans were no longer just asking whether Elvis Presley had been replaced on stage. They were asking a deeper, more unsettling question. How much of the man they loved had been lost long before anyone noticed? The more people listened to Lisa Marie Presley, the more they realized she wasn't trying to create a conspiracy. She was trying to explain a feeling, something she had lived with for years but could never fully put into words. And that feeling was now spreading to everyone else who looked closely enough. One of the most talked about details came from her description of quiet moments at home. Away from the stage, away from the lights, Elvis was different. Not just calmer, but real. He would sit for hours, sometimes saying very little, sometimes opening up in ways that no audience ever saw. He laughed differently. He moved differently. Even his voice carried a softer tone, one that didn't need to fill an arena. Lisa Marie described those moments as the only times she truly felt she was with her father, not the icon, not the legend, but the man himself. And that contrast, she hinted, was where the truth began to reveal itself. Because the moment he stepped back into the public world, everything changed. It wasn't instant, but it was noticeable. The posture would shift. The expression would harden slightly. The warmth in his eyes would fade into something more controlled, more practiced. It was like watching someone prepare to play a role they had performed so many times, they no longer questioned it. At first, this might sound normal. After all, performers step into personas all the time. But according to Lisa Marie, this wasn't just a stage presence. It was deeper, more permanent.
There were days, she explained, when the transition didn't fully reverse. When the show ended and the crowd went home and the lights went out, part of that other Elvis stayed behind. This is where the story began to take on a darker tone. Because if a persona becomes strong enough, if it's fed by constant attention, expectation, and pressure, it doesn't just disappear when the performance ends. It starts to take over. And for Elvis Presley, that line may have been crossed long before anyone realized it. Lisa Marie recalled moments that confused her as a child. She would approach her father, expecting the same warmth she had felt just hours earlier, only to be met with distance. Not coldness exactly, but a kind of emotional absence, as if he was there physically, but not fully present. She didn't understand it then. How could she? But as she grew older, those memories began to connect. They formed a pattern, one that pointed to something far more serious than mood swings or exhaustion. It was as if Elvis was living in two worlds at once, and slowly, those worlds were colliding. Fans who revisited old interviews started noticing something similar. In some clips, Elvis appeared relaxed, even playful, cracking jokes, speaking openly, showing flashes of vulnerability. In others, he seemed guarded, almost scripted, delivering answers that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. The difference wasn't subtle once you knew what to look for. It raised an uncomfortable possibility. What if the real Elvis wasn't missing from the stage because of a physical replacement, but because he was being overshadowed by something else?
Something built over years of expectation, fame, and relentless pressure. This idea didn't dismiss the strange stories, it reframed them. The different performances, the subtle inconsistencies, the moments that felt off, they could all be signs of an internal battle rather than an external deception. But not everyone was convinced. Some insiders continued to suggest that there were still details the public didn't know. Small things that didn't fit neatly into the psychological explanation, timelines that didn't quite add up, rehearsals that were unusually closed off, and a level of secrecy that seemed excessive, even for a star of Elvis's magnitude. One former staff member claimed there were strict instructions about limiting access before certain shows. Another hinted that last-minute changes were more common than people realized. None of these claims were ever fully verified, but they added fuel to a fire that was already burning brighter than ever. And through it all, Lisa Marie remained careful. She never confirmed the more extreme theories. She never said there was a double or a replacement, but she also never completely dismissed the idea that something unusual had been happening behind the scenes. Instead, she focused on what she knew, what she had seen, what she had felt, what she had lived. She spoke about the loneliness, the pressure, the impossible expectations placed on a man who was never allowed to fail. She described how the world didn't just want Elvis to succeed, they needed him to. And when someone becomes that important, that essential, the system around them will do anything to keep the image alive, even if the person at the center begins to break. And that's when the story took its most haunting turn. Because if the real Elvis was slowly disappearing under the weight of his own legend, then the performances weren't just entertainment, they were survival. Each show wasn't just about music, it was about maintaining the illusion.
Keeping the world convinced that everything was still perfect, that the king was still in control, that nothing had changed. But something had, and deep down the people closest to him knew it. Lisa Marie didn't need to say it directly. It was already there, hidden between her words, waiting for people to understand. The man the world saw under those bright stage lights was only part of the story, and maybe, just maybe, the real Elvis had been fading long before the final curtain ever fell. By now, the illusion had grown so strong that separating truth from performance felt almost impossible. The world still saw Elvis Presley as untouchable, larger than life, unstoppable, eternal. But behind that image, something fragile was beginning to crack, and those cracks were no longer hidden from everyone. The people closest to him had started to notice patterns they couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the difference between private and public Elvis anymore. It was the unpredictability. Some nights he would walk into a room and completely own it, radiating the same magnetic energy that made him a global icon. Other nights he seemed distant, distracted, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. The shift could happen within hours, sometimes even minutes,
and no one could explain why. Lisa Marie Presley had seen this more closely than anyone. As she grew older, the confusion she once felt as a child turned into concern. She began to realize that this wasn't just about mood swings or exhaustion. Something deeper was happening, something that was slowly taking pieces of her father away. She described moments that felt almost surreal, times when she would speak to him and get a response that felt slightly delayed, as if he had to return before answering. Moments where his expression didn't quite match the situation, where his reactions felt just a little out of sync. These weren't dramatic, obvious changes, but they were enough to create a quiet sense of unease.
And then there were the nights before certain performances. Those nights stood out the most. According to Lisa Marie, there was a tension in the air that was impossible to ignore. Conversations became shorter. Movements became more deliberate. The entire environment shifted into something tightly controlled, almost rehearsed beyond necessity. It wasn't just preparation, it felt like coordination, like everyone was playing a role in making sure something went exactly as planned. Some crew members would later describe similar experiences. They spoke about how access to Elvis became more restricted at specific times, how even familiar faces were sometimes kept at a distance. There were moments when the usual routine changed without explanation. Different entrances, different timing, different interactions. Small details, but when combined, they created a pattern that felt intentional. And this is where the story took another turn. Because while the psychological explanation still made sense, the idea of a man overwhelmed by his own legend, these details hinted at something more structured, something organized. The question quietly returned. Was it all just internal struggle, or was there an external system ensuring the show never failed? At the center of that question remained Colonel Tom Parker. For years, he had been seen as the architect of Elvis's success, the man who turned raw talent into a global phenomenon. But now, his role was being re-examined through a different lens. Parker was known for his strict control over Elvis's career. Every deal, every appearance, every major decision passed through him. He understood the business better than anyone, and he knew exactly what the world expected from Elvis. To him, consistency wasn't just important, it was everything. Because in a world driven by fame and money, unpredictability is dangerous, and Elvis, as a human being, was becoming unpredictable. This created a conflict that may have defined the final years of his life. On one side, there was the real man, tired, pressured, struggling to keep up with the demands placed on him. On the other side, there was the image, the flawless performer the world refused to let go of. And somewhere between those two, decisions had to be made, decisions that may never be fully known to the public. Lisa Marie never accused Parker directly. She never pointed fingers or made bold claims, but she didn't need to. The way she described the environment, the control, the pressure, it painted a picture that spoke for itself. A system that didn't allow for weakness, a system that couldn't afford to stop, even if the person at its center needed it to. And that's what made the situation so haunting, because whether the theories about doubles or replacements were true or not, something undeniable was happening. The performances continued, the image remained intact, the legend never faltered, but the man behind it was changing. Fans who revisited concert footage from those later years began noticing it more clearly than ever. The contrast between performances became sharper. Some shows felt alive, full of energy and authenticity. Others felt almost too perfect, controlled, precise, lacking the spontaneous spark that once defined Elvis. It was subtle, but once seen, it couldn't be unseen. And then there were the moments that didn't fit either category. Moments where Elvis seemed caught between two versions of himself. A glance that lingered too long. A pause that didn't belong. A shift in expression that hinted at something deeper, something unresolved. These weren't the moments that made headlines. They were too small, too fleeting, but they were real, and they told a story that no official narrative ever could. A story of a man trying to hold on to himself while the world demanded something else entirely. A story of a legend that had become so powerful, it started to consume the person it was built around. By this point, the question was no longer whether the real Elvis had ever been replaced on stage. The question was whether he had been slowly replaced within his own life, replaced by expectations, replaced by pressure, replaced by a version of himself that the world refused to let go of. And as that realization settled in, one thing became clear. Whatever the full truth was, it wasn't simple. It wasn't a single moment or a single decision. It was a process, slow, complex, and deeply human. But there was still one piece missing, one final layer that Lisa Marie Presley had only hinted at, but never fully revealed. Because even after everything she had shared, there was still a sense that she was holding something back, not out of fear, but because some truths don't just change how we see a legend, they change how we remember him forever. The final piece of the story didn't arrive with a dramatic announcement. There was no single interview, no headline that revealed everything at once. Instead, it came quietly, through reflection, through emotion, through the weight carried in the words of Lisa Marie Presley as she spoke about her father in a way she never had before. By this point, the world had already formed countless theories about Elvis Presley. Some believed in doubles, others believed in manipulation, control, or carefully constructed illusions. But Lisa Marie's final perspective didn't confirm any of those ideas directly. Instead, it did something far more powerful. It brought the focus back to something real, something human. She described her father not as a mystery, not as a symbol, but as a man who was overwhelmed by a life no one could truly understand, a man who gave everything to the stage, to the fans, to the image the world demanded, and slowly lost parts of himself in the process. According to her, the question was never, was the real Elvis on stage? The real question was, how much of him was left by the time he walked onto it? That single idea changed everything. Because suddenly, all the strange moments, the pauses, the differences, the inconsistencies, they didn't point to a replacement. They pointed to exhaustion. They pointed to a man who had been pushed beyond his limits for so long that even he couldn't always hold on to who he used to be. Lisa Marie spoke about the emotional cost of fame in a way that made the entire story feel heavier. She explained how the world didn't just love Elvis, they needed him to be perfect. They needed him to be strong, energetic, unforgettable every single night. And when millions of people expect that from you, there's no space left to fall apart. There's no space left to be human. And that's where the truth finally revealed itself. Not in a conspiracy, not in a secret replacement, but in a quiet, devastating reality. The real Elvis was never missing from the stage. He was buried beneath it. Every performance, every smile, every iconic movement, it wasn't fake, but it wasn't complete either. It was a version of him shaped and polished for the world, while the rest of him struggled behind the scenes to keep up. Lisa Marie's words made people look back at everything differently. The performances that once seemed off now felt emotional. The moments of hesitation now felt meaningful. Even the distance some fans had noticed began to make sense. It wasn't a lack of connection. It was the cost of maintaining one under impossible pressure. She also revealed something deeply personal, something that stayed with those who heard it. She said that despite everything, despite the changes, the distance, the struggle, her father never stopped caring. He never stopped loving his fans. In fact, that love may have been the very reason he kept going, even when it became too much. That realization added a bittersweet layer to the entire story, because it meant that the performances weren't just obligations, they were sacrifices. Each time Elvis Presley stepped onto that stage, he wasn't just entertaining, he was giving a piece of himself. And over time, those pieces added up, until there was less and less left to give. And suddenly, the idea that the real Elvis was never on stage took on a completely different meaning. Not because he was replaced, not because someone else took his place, but because the version the world saw was only ever a part of who he truly was. The rest, the quieter, softer, more human side, remained hidden, protected, and slowly worn down by the weight of everything around it. Lisa Marie didn't frame it as a tragedy. She didn't speak with anger or blame. Instead, there was a sense of understanding in her words, almost acceptance, as if she had come to terms with the reality that her father's life was never meant to be simple.
It was meant to be legendary. And legends, as powerful as they are, always come with a cost. In the end, there was no shocking twist, no hidden figure stepping out from behind the curtain, no final reveal that confirmed the wildest theories. Just the truth. A man, a life, and the price of becoming something the world could never let go of. As fans processed everything, the mystery didn't completely disappear, but it changed. It became less about uncovering secrets and more about understanding a story that had always been right in front of them. The story of a man who gave the world everything it asked for, even when it asked for more than he could afford to give. And maybe that's the real reason this story still matters, because it's not just about Elvis Presley. It's about what happens when someone becomes so iconic, so essential, that the world forgets they were human to begin with. And as the lights faded, as the music ended, and as the legend continued to live on in history, one truth remained: quiet, powerful, and impossible to ignore. The real Elvis was always there, just not in the way the world expected.